911 center. What's the matter?
Oh my God.
Okay, and what's going on?
My mom.
Your mom what?
My mom is dead.
A mother of 6 brutally murdered in her own home.
Okay, what makes you think that?
There's blood all around the place and she has a cut on her neck.
Her throat slashed and a bullet through her face.
Sarah, then you
All while her toddler quadruplets watched in horror.
Okay, who else is in the house there?
I have my brothers and sisters.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
Here's Stevie, 13-year-old girl, comes home from school, finds her mother with a bullet through her face and her throat cut.
Who could commit such a monstrous act, and why target this ordinary family?
Okay, stay on line. Are your brothers and sisters younger than you?
43 months.
The answers would unravel a twisted tale of greed, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder that would stretch across state lines.
Okay, Stevie, we have help on the way.
I'm going to take you down south now to Sarasota, where the notorious murder-for-hire case of Sheila Bellush.
Sheila Bellush.
There's some evidence with the crime.
We wanted a baby really bad, and then we got 4.
I'm 95 years old. It's the worst crime I ever heard in my life.
On November 7th, 1997, in Sarasota, Florida, 13-year-old Stevie Bellush came home and found a horrifying scene. That morning had started off normal, and by the end of the school day, Stevie rushed home to tell her mom some good news. Stevie was excited to tell her mom that the boy that she had a crush on was going to ask her out soon. But as she reached the front door, she had this uneasy feeling. She felt like something was wrong, and as she walked in the front door, the first thing she saw was her 4 younger siblings crying. She was confused at first and thought, why wasn't her mother attending to them? She then thought, well, maybe I should check in the utility room. When she opened that door, the floors and walls were painted with blood. Her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellush, lay dead on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Sheila's throat had been viciously cut, and she'd been shot point blank in the face. And what's even worse is that her 2-year-old quadruplets were found wandering around the house, leaving tiny little footprints of her blood. When Stevie sees this, she begins crying uncontrollably and manages to call 911. In the background, you can actually hear the baby screaming and crying as well, even though they don't know what's going on. As investigators arrived to the gruesome scene, they were baffled. They saw something that they've never seen before. 4 toddlers covered in blood splatter and a 13-year-old girl standing beside her mother's dead body. Lead detectives Ron Alberton and Chris Lorio arrived to the scene immediately, and these were 2 very high-skilled detectives. Even though they've been doing this for a very long time and have seen pretty horrific stuff, this was by far the most baffling case they've ever seen. Who would want this mother of 6 dead, and how could someone commit such a savage act with 4 toddlers present? The answers would prove even more chilling than the crime itself. I'm glad to say that the toddlers had no injuries, but they were still walking around their mother's blood, and clearly they were confused of what was going on. The garage held the first clues as to what happened. These investigators found a towel with gunshot residue and a hole in it. It's obvious that the killer tried to use this as a silencer, but the material must have jammed the gun at some point. There was a bullet casing on top of the dryer, and just behind that, on the utility room wall, was a single bullet hole. Technicians dusted off the dryer, and thankfully they were able to find a solid fingerprint. The blood trail led to the kitchen, where a bloody knife was found on the floor. It matched the same knives as the ones on the magnetic rack in the kitchen, so it definitely belonged to the Bellushes. Piece by piece, the picture came together. It seems that since the gun jammed, the killer decided to resort to anything that was nearby, which in this case was the knife. Sheila's throat was cut with such force that the tip of the knife was bent, but that wasn't the final blow. It seems that Sheila was alive for many minutes after that. Crime scene evidence showed that in Sheila's last moments alive, she tried to grab the phone to call 911. Now, to better understand the events leading up to this fateful day, we need to go back and examine Sheila's past. Sheila Lane Walsh was born in 1962 in Topeka, Kansas. In 1982, at just 20 years old, she married a man named Alan Blackthorne. The couple had 2 daughters together, Stevie and Daryl, but their marriage was far from happy. Alan Blackthorne was described as manipulative and abusive. Court records showed he was arrested in 1987 for assaulting Sheila, leaving her with a busted lip. Sheila's family would later say how he threatened her if she ever tried to leave him.
Did you ever threaten to kill her if she were to ever leave you and take the girls?
No, never. No threat of any kind.
Then, after 5 years of marriage, Sheila finally found the courage to file for divorce. But escaping Alan wasn't going to be easy, and he made her life a living nightmare. They had a bitter divorce and custody battle, and he would drag Sheila to court again and again. Police logs show numerous family disturbance calls during this time. It was a constant struggle for Sheila. Eventually, Sheila was awarded custody of their 2 daughters. She was also granted 20% ownership of Alan's multi-million-dollar company, plus $170,000 in civil damages. In total, Alan Blackthorne owed Sheila over $1 million, and he had no other option but to file for bankruptcy. When this was all done, Sheila felt like now it was time for her to move on with her life. And in 1993, she fell in love and married Jamie Bellush, a pharmaceutical sales representative. Soon after, in 1995, the couple welcomed quadruplets, 3 boys and 1 girl. It seemed that finally Sheila had found her happily ever after, and she even became a local celebrity known as the Quad Mom. But Alan Blackthorne wasn't done tormenting Sheila. He continued to harass her and refused to leave her alone. So in 1997, Sheila and Jamie decided to move the entire family to Sarasota, Florida, over 1,200 miles away from Allen in Texas. They hoped that the distance would finally allow them to escape his reach. But tragically, they were wrong. Sheila found being a new mom overwhelming, especially since Jamie was always out of town for work. But Sheila found the strength and carried on, and the people around her described her as a fun mom who was always around her kids, very active, and had no known enemies. But if that was true, then why would someone want her dead? On that November day, an intruder broke into the house through an unlocked window. He hid and waited for an hour and watched as Sheila was doing things around the house, taking care of her kids. And the moment Sheila noticed that one of the doors were open, they made eye contact and he attacked her. The attacker shot Sheila in the face with a .45 caliber handgun, and then he went into the kitchen, grabbed the kitchen knife, and slashed her throat, all while her children watched. The killer fled, leaving the toddlers alone with their mother's mutilated corpse for hours. The investigators knew that they were dealing with a cold, calculated killer. This was no random act of violence. Someone had specifically targeted Sheila for execution. But who and why? Suspicion immediately fell on her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne. Given their history and the money that he owed her, he clearly had a motive. However, Alan had a pretty solid alibi. He was golfing in Texas at the Oak Hills County Club at the time of the murder, over 1,200 miles away. So police turned to the next viable suspect, her husband, Jamie Bellush. When Jamie arrived to the scene, he was visibly hysterical, so investigators gave him a minute to calm down before asking him questions. But what Jamie would go on to say right away to investigators really surprised them. Jamie asked investigators if he needed an attorney, and they thought, well, this is something really odd to ask if you're innocent. Why would Jamie need a lawyer? What was he hiding? Now, suspicious, investigators escorted Jamie to the Sarasota's sheriff's office for questioning. They had to find motive. Jamie described the events of that day. He was working as per usual at the office when he got the call that something bad had happened. He raced home, and when he arrived, he ran under the police barrier and saw several officers standing in front of his house. Jamie says that he hugged one of the officers and asked him for prayers before running to his stepdaughter's side. Jamie was a no-nonsense kind of character, and he wasn't going to be intimidated by the detective's questions. It was obvious that he was worried about his kids and his stepkids, Daryl and Stevie. Then the conversation went back to Alan Blackthorne, and Jamie described Alan as an incredibly wealthy and flashy person. Jamie says that Alan had 3 cars, golfed all the time, and lived in a huge mansion. He said that Alan was manipulative and had been abusive in the past. He also said that there was still ongoing issues with paying child support, and Alan would often complain about the amount that he had to send to Sheila. Detectives were at a loss because Jamie also had an alibi. He had been working in Fort Myers at the time of the murder. Additionally, there was no evidence to place him at the crime scene. So even though Alan had an alibi, detectives thought that it was still worthwhile to speak to him so that they can shed more light on this case. When they called Alan, what really shocked them was that he was very nonchalant about the entire situation. He said that he already knew that Sheila was dead because he saw it on the news. There was no grief in his voice whatsoever, and this immediately raised alarm bells for the detectives. At the end of the day, Sheila was the mother of Alan's 2 daughters, so you would think that he would be somewhat emotional about this. Initially, there was no more leads, but as this was broadcasted across the nation, detectives began receiving more phone calls. Most led nowhere, but one call was different. It was from a woman who worked at a gas station on Bee Ridge Road. She said that on the day of the murder, a man had come in and asked for directions to Mark Ridge Road, the same road that Sheila lived on. The man was described to be either Hispanic or Italian and dressed in camo combat gear. This made investigators very interested because now they had another lead, and this woman would go on to add that she had given this man a laminated map of Sarasota and explained how to get to that road. She then told detectives one more thing. She said that she still had the map. So the 2 detectives rushed to the gas station and retrieved the map, and then they took it for forensics to get it dusted and to see if there was any fingerprints. Miraculously, they were able to lift one, and it was a match to the thumbprint found on the dryer. They had their guy. It was an unbelievable turn of events, but it wouldn't end there. It was only days later that they received another tip from a man named Jacob Mast, who was working on the lawns in Mark Ridge Road on November 7th. Jacob had noticed a man in the neighborhood who looked out of place. He made a mental note to remember the license plate number of the car that the man was driving. The detectives ran the number as a Florida plate, but no results came up. Then they formed a theory. It was a wild one, but it was the only one that made sense. They figured since Alan and Sheila were both from Texas, they decided to run the numbers on a Texas tag. And bingo, the car was registered out of Texas. The owner of the car was a woman named Maria del Toro La Prior. But this woman was in her 60s, so investigators thought, well, how could this woman of this age be able to carry out a crime as violent as this? So who was driving? On November 9th, detectives Albertin and Lorio went to Maria's residence. They interviewed Maria and she said, yes, this is my car, but it's mainly used by my 21-year-old grandson, Jose Luis del Toro, also known as Joey. After looking into Joey, he had no prior criminal record. He had been a star football player in his high school and he was known to party a lot. But now authorities had enough evidence to match Joey to the crime scene, which meant probable cause. Maria gave them the address of Joey's girlfriend's house in Austin, and there they spotted the car in the parking lot. Inside the home was Joey's girlfriend, but she told authorities that Joey had left days earlier. All that he had left behind was the car, as well as a small duffel bag with the camo clothing that matched what the witness said. The car was towed to the DPS crime unit in Austin, and inside the vehicle there was so much evidence. Experts found receipts from several stores where Joey bought the camo clothing. The gun was also found in the vehicle, which was a .45 caliber and had 3 magazines that matched the casing found at the Bellush home. And stuffed inside the side compartment was several maps of Florida. Investigators probably felt like they hit the jackpot because they were able to track all these people, which eventually led them to this man with all this evidence. But they weren't done yet. Yeah, I mean, detectives had their lead suspect, but what they didn't have was the link. Just how was Joey connected to Sheila? Why would he want her dead? The 2 detectives interviewed Joey's friends and family and tried to figure out where he could possibly be hiding. And they all said the same thing. They said to speak to Sammy Gonzalez, who was Joey's cousin. The detectives quickly located Sammy and brought him into the Texas Ranger Station where the investigation began. In the interview, investigators quickly realized that Sammy looked nervous and it looked like he was hiding something. Eventually he cracked and he said that he just wanted to get the truth out. He admitted that he was involved and then proceeded to blow the lid on an entire conspiracy. Sammy said that it all began with a friend of his named Danny Rocha. Danny had told him that there was a woman that he needed to beat up and that there would be cash involved for whoever did the job. Sammy offered up Joey with the promise of a few $100,000. When Sammy talked to Joey, he was more than willing to get involved, so Sammy relayed this back to Danny. In the summer of 1997, the 3 of them met up together in Texas, where Danny talked them through the plan. He said that if Sheila was killed, it would be better, and each of them would get $10,000 plus more if it all went according to plan. It was really strange that Sammy and Joey willingly agreed to this. It wasn't like either of them really needed the cash, but it was easy money, and greed took over common sense or morality. It seemed simple enough, they just had to make sure that they didn't get caught. It's genuinely so scary to see the extent people will go just to make money. Now detectives had the threads tying all 3 men together, but they couldn't figure out what Danny's motive was. How was he connected to Sheila? Why would someone orchestrate a murder for hire on an innocent woman that he's never met before? Danny had no clear connection to Jamie Bellush, so they immediately eliminated Jamie as a potential suspect. They knew that they had to push Sammy further, so Sammy confessed that Joey had called him the Monday morning before he fled. He said that he was frantic because he knew that the cops from Sarasota were after him and had landed in Texas. So at 3 a.m. that Monday morning, Joey boarded a bus in San Antonio that took him across the border into Mexico to Laredo. This case had officially gone beyond state lines, and this was bad, really bad, because now that meant there would be legal roadblocks ahead as well as a fugitive on the run. News spread across the border when a sketch of Joey was released, and Mexican authorities were also alerted. Soon after, radio stations began receiving phone calls from civilians who said that they spotted Joey walking around in Mexico. Things began closing in on him, and as authorities searched every single lead, detectives in Florida began working with the prosecution in Florida and Texas to start building a case. The attorneys assigned were Richard Dubin and John Murphy, both hard hitters and absolutely dedicated to their craft. They said that if anyone could get this case off the ground, it would be these 2 people. But first, the major link had to be uncovered. Who was Danny Rocha? He was known as a hustler, but he never actively committed a crime. Then they found something very interesting. When investigators were going through the records, they found that Danny had a membership at the Oak Hills County Club, the same club that Alan Blackthorne went to. In fact, the tie was closer than they thought. Danny was actually Alan's golf partner. This was too much of a coincidence. You see, Danny and Alan had a common interest: golf and money. Alan played for the love of the game and to spend as much money as he could, while Danny played simply for money. It was said that the pair would bet large amounts of money on golf, and in 1 year, Danny received $300,000 from Alan. Alan realized that Danny was money hungry and figured that he could manipulate his golf buddy into doing something else, something that would aid in Alan's vendetta against his ex-wife Sheila. Alan offered Danny $54,000 to have Sheila taken care of. Then Danny recruited Sammy Gonzalez to find someone to carry out the hit. But now you're thinking, why was Danny so willing and eager to act out this plan? Well, Alan had told Danny that Sheila was physically abusing their daughters, but the courts had sided with her, and the only way to get his daughters back and away from Sheila was if she died. With the pieces in place, the deadly plan was set in motion, but first, they had to find Sheila. Alan went to great lengths to track down his ex-wife's new address in Florida. He hired a private investigator, posed as a bookie trying to collect the debt, and even manipulated his own daughters into revealing where they lived. Once he had this information, he passed it down to Danny, who gave it to Del Toro. Del Toro made the 1,300-mile journey from Texas to Florida. Now that the detectives had the link, how would they prove it in court? The next best option was to get Danny to turn on Alan. They began surveilling Danny's home, and on one particular day, Danny walked outside. Detectives got out of their car and they immediately approached Danny, and he didn't seem fazed at all. He knew what was coming, so he immediately requested an attorney. This meant that he could not be arrested or interviewed without legal counsel, and once again, authorities were blocked from acting. There was nothing they could do, and they just left. Detectives made their way to Alan Blackthorne's mansion in San Antonio. It was huge and pink, exactly the type of facade that a man as arrogant as Alan would want to project his wealth. When detectives arrived, they were invited in by Alan's wife, Maureen. She knew exactly who they were, and as she stood in front of them, she got on the phone and called Alan and told him that we have company. It was obviously code for something, because only a minute later, Alan's attorney, Roy Barrera, calls and asks to speak to the detectives. His first question was, are there any outstanding warrants for my client? And of course, the detective said no, and the lawyer responded that he needs to be with his client when he speaks to authorities. A few moments later, Alan arrived home, and detectives said that he was exactly what they pictured. He was cocky and arrogant and believed that he was above the law. To Alan, these were small-time detectives from Florida, and they were not a threat to him. So now what? There was still no trace of Joey and no way to get Alan to talk. Danny now also refused to talk, so authorities had to come up with a plan. Arrest someone and hope that the rest would break. Florida and Texas prosecutors gathered enough evidence to build a case against Danny Rocha and Sammy Gonzalez, and they were both arrested. Allegedly, when one of the detectives went to take Danny into custody, Danny looked at him and simply asked, "Is it time?" I feel like at this time, Danny probably felt like there was nothing else he could do, and he just had to come forward with all the information and details that he knows. On November 18th, there was more promising news. Detective Ron Albertin received a phone call that Joey had been arrested in Monterrey, Mexico. Now, the race was to extradite him back to the US, but unsurprisingly, there were more major roadblocks. Sammy broke first, agreeing to a plea bargain for 20 years in prison in exchange for his testimony against Joey and Danny. It was critical for prosecutors to make a bridge between Joey, Sammy, Danny, Alan, and Sammy's testimony was the first step to achieve that. The same plea bargain was offered to Danny, but he flat out turned it down. If he agreed to testify against Alan, he wanted it to keep him out of jail completely. Danny was sure that he would not go to prison, and so ultimately no deal was ever brought to the table for him. It was a risk, and Danny was betting his life on it. On January 11th, 1999, the trial against Danny Rocha began. Danny had blamed everything on Joey, saying that Joey had killed Sheila instead of following instructions to just beat her up. Danny denied any physical involvement, and it was all up to the prosecution to convince the jury that none of this could have taken place without Danny's involvement. On January 14th, 14th, Sammy testified. He claimed that Danny had told Joey that the easiest way to get the money was to shoot Sheila. This was enough to bury the case. In the end, the jury found Danny guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Danny couldn't believe it. His plan failed and he would be locked up while Alan Blackthorne walked free. But it wasn't long before Danny realized something as he sat in prison. He realized that Alan had played him, so he agreed to testify against Alan in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. The prosecution began building a case while Alan maintained his innocence. In 1999, a bigger contender took over: the FBI. In federal court, there was a new legislation called the Violence Against Women Act, which stated that it was unlawful to travel in interstate to cause harm to a former partner. The prosecution could prove interstate travel. They had Alan's cell phone records, which showed that he had connected to a cell phone tower in Macon, Georgia after the murder, and the next day when he traveled to Hillsboro, Texas. This was all they needed, and the motion to detail Alan was filed. In January 2020, Alan Blackthorne was finally arrested and charged with interstate conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Finally, the case that had stretched on for 3 years was coming to an end. His trial began in June of that year, with prosecutors painting him as this vengeful, greedy man willing to have the mother of his children butchered to avoid paying what he owed her. It was a media sensation, with reporters from dozens of channels attending. Alan, of course, was overconfident and hired 5 lawyers. The prosecution's case looked great because they had the other conspirators testifying. They described how Alan Blackthorne had meticulously planned Sheila's murder for over a year, and he offered a lot of money to have it done. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching evidence they had was Stevie's 911 call and photos of the quadruplets' bloody footprints everywhere throughout the house. The jurors were horrified to learn that the toddlers had been left with their mother's mutilated body for hours. This set the foundation for the rest of the trial, particularly when the crime scene investigators were called up to the stand and described how they felt when they saw these little kids running around with blood all over them and with their mother just laying there. The photos presented were horrific and brutal, and the jurors certainly got the message. On the stand, Stevie bravely recounted what she had seen on the day of Sheila's death, and even told the court that she had stopped referring to Alan as dad. Meanwhile, Alan watched with no emotions and no empathy whatsoever. The next witness was Danny Rocha. He had a bone to pick with Alan, and his first statement was, "I have nothing to gain or lose." He told the court that Alan had plotted to kill Sheila, and the terms and intent had changed over time. He first promised $10,000 and then $50,000, and the motive was clear. Once Sheila was dead, each accomplice would receive about $10,000 and even more if he was able to regain custody of his 2 daughters. The defense tried to paint Danny as this unreliable and worthless witness. But then the trial took an unexpected turn that no one saw coming. On June 13th, Alan arrived to court and his lawyer announced that he was going to testify. This was incredibly risky, but Alan was arrogant and believed he could outsmart the prosecution and the jury. His plan was to convince them all that he was innocent. So Alan Blackthorne took the stand in his own defense and claimed that everything he'd done was for his children. But prosecutors easily poked holes in the narrative, pointing he hadn't even sent his daughters a birthday card since their mother's death. Alan insisted that he never hated Sheila, he just hated the things that she did. It became almost a running joke in court. Alan didn't hate Sheila, he just hated the things she did. And this led to him ordering the murder and making her toddlers watch. Alan's attempt to defend himself was pitiful. His arrogance had led him to his downfall. Before the trial ended, authorities caught another break where they received news that Joey Del Toro would be released and flown to Miami International Airport. As his airplane touched down, detectives met him at the gate and they escorted him to the station where he immediately confessed. He said that when he arrived to Sheila's house, he got inside through an unlocked window and he watched as she interacted with her kids for about an hour. He said that he almost left, and what really struck him was how attentive she was to her kids. Which that part gives me chills, because clearly Sheila was an amazing mother and loved her kids, and her life was taken, and now her kids are going to live the rest of their life without their mother. He then said that instead of turning around and leaving, he stayed, and then Sheila spotted him. Then he knew he couldn't turn back and he had to get the job done and kill her. It was a bizarre explanation. For $10,000, Joy would get life in prison. It seemed like an unfair trade-off. Ultimately, he pled guilty and received 2 consecutive life sentences for first-degree murder and armed burglary. After 5 weeks of testimony and over 33 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict and Alan Blackthorne was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in federal prison. But even with the killers behind bars, the tragedy was far from over for Sheila's family. Her husband Jamie was left to raise 6 children on his own, including 4 traumatized toddlers. The quadruplets would grow up with no memories of their mother, only the knowledge that she was brutally taken from them. And I'm sure that they know that they were there when their mother's lives was taken. Sheila's older daughters, Stevie and Daryl, were robbed of their mother and betrayed by their father in the most horrific way. Not only did these 2 girls lose their mother, but they also lost their father as well, who's gonna spend the rest of his life in prison. And on top of that, they're forced to deal with all this trauma and help raise the younger siblings who had no idea what was going on at the time. The case left many wondering how a father could orchestrate such a savage act against the mother of his kids. What level of hatred and greed can drive a man to have his ex-wife butchered in front of her toddlers? Some speculated that Alan Blackthorne's actions stemmed from a need for control. Unable to accept that Sheila had moved on and built a new life without him, he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one else could. The fact that he was willing to orphan his own daughters in the process speaks to the depths of his depravity. Others theorized that Alan's motive was purely financial. By having Sheila killed, he hoped to avoid paying her all the money he owed her from the divorce settlement. In his own twisted logic, spending $54,000 on a hitman was preferable to paying over $1 million to his ex-wife. The case also raised questions about how an elaborate murder-for-hire plot could be orchestrated across state lines. How was Alan able to manipulate so many people to participate in Sheila's murder? And how close did he come to getting away with it entirely? Sheila's murder is a terrifying example of how the most dangerous predators often hide in plain sight. A bitter ex-husband destroyed multiple lives and families. Ultimately, Alan passed away at the age of 59 in federal prison, and the cause of death has never been released. Decades later, Sheila's family continues to grieve her loss. One can't help but wonder what other monsters are plotting similar acts of calculated evil against those who least expect it.